Hi, I'm Enrica Orsini, Education Scientific Lead at EHA, and I'm here today with Professor Robin Foà to speak about Philadelphia positive acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Professor Foà, can you please introduce yourself?
Okay, well, you said who I am. I'm Robin Foà. I am Emeritus Professor of Hematology at the Sapienza University in Rome, Italy.
So, Professor Foà, you dedicated your lecture after receiving the José Carreras Award at the EHA Congress this year, 2023, to Philadelphia positive ALL. Where does your interest for this pathology come from?
Okay, well, this is a long story, in fact, because not being a kid anymore, I've been around for quite a number of years, and you know, when we talk about the Philadelphia positive ALL in more detail, it'll come up that the approach and the management of this disease has changed dramatically over the last, I would say, 20 years in general, and then more specifically, more recently, to an extent now, and we'll go discuss this, I'm sure, in more detail, that we can think of managing many, possibly most adult patients with Ph positive ALL without chemotherapy and transplant, and I'm sure we'll go into detail about this. So where did it start? Well, I've always had an interest in, I would say, in immunology and in immunotherapy over the years. And in fact, during a lecture for the José Carreras Award, there's something I will cover. And I will show that I started working on, not on neoplastic cells, but say on the immune compartment many, many years ago. I mean, this started when I was working in London at the Hammersmith Hospital with Danny Katowski, who I'll quote during a lecture because he passed away only 6 months ago. And I was very close to him. And I worked in those days on T and NK cells in chronic lymphocytic leukemia, so in a chronic disease, not an acute, which is something nobody was interested in. You worked on the leukemic cells, which are B, but there's an interest in the accessory cells. And from there, many studies we've done over the years. We used interleukin-2 to treat acute leukemias. We did gene transfers, transducing cytokine genes to try to stimulate the host immune system against the tumor. So the whole story of immunotherapy has been very interesting for us, and we've worked a lot about that. And I was involved also in the development of bispecific monoclonal antibodies, and particularly blinatumomab. So I think that is the whole tie, and then this will all, let's say, add up and tie up in a Ph positive ALL story.
And so, how did all this come up to the Ph positive ALL? What is the situation for this disease treatment today?
Yes, I think the background is that Ph positive ALL, I'm saying this for the younger generation, was in the old days the worst hematological malignancies. And I always used to say to the younger generation, possibly was the worst cancer you could get. Because the prognosis in those days was dismal, and the only chance was an allogeneic transplant, if at all you could reach a transplant. But you've got to respond to treatment to get to a transplant. That was the first point. This was before the tyrosine kinase inhibitors came on the scene. I'll come back to that in a minute. The second point that we have to keep in mind that the Philadelphia positive ALL is the most frequent genetic lesion in adult ALL, and it increases with age. So while it's very rare in children, but in adults, starting from 18 up, it increases, but it's low in young adults and increases. And in patients over the age of 50, 55, about or even more than 1 out of 2 B lineage L carry the Philadelphia chromosome or the BCR-ABL. So it's frequent. That's the other important point. So the turning point was what? Was tyrosine kinase inhibitors. I mean, the story goes that we've changed the natural history of chronic myeloid leukemia with imatinib first, and then with second and third generation TKIs. And we've learned that with TKIs, the prognosis of CML has changed dramatically. And now many of these patients can have a life expectancy which is similar to a normal population without match per age without CML. So that is a revolution induced by learning the mechanism. And I'll show a slide during the presentation of how we learned from the Philadelphia chromosome to the TKI, and that's a fantastic story. So carrying the same genetic lesion, it was at some point obvious, seen the data in CML, to transfer TKIs to Philadelphia positive ALL. So my interest goes back to that, and in fact, we were just about the first to start this, and it's interesting because we tend to forget this, starting from myself, that we started using TKI in induction without chemotherapy, only with the TKI and steroids, no chemotherapy, back in the year 2000, so that's a long time ago. And we decided to do that, and just to make a bit of history, I think it's nice to recall that we started discussing this opportunity with an old friend who also passed away recently, who is Michele Baccarani, who has had a very important role in chronic myeloid leukemia, and we're talking with him at a meeting somewhere, I can't remember where, but outside the meeting, we started thinking, well, based on the CML data, why don't we think of using imatinib in H-positive ALL? So that's how it started, and we set up the first protocol for Philadelphia positive ALL frontline for elderly patients. Why elderly? Because we had to decide not to give chemotherapy, and that was a bit unusual in acute leukemia, particularly ALL with a poor prognosis. But being elderly, many patients did not put up with chemo, and they only received palliative treatment. So it was ethically acceptable, and in fact all ethical committees approved it, to give only imatinib and steroids in patients over the age of 60 with no upper age limit. So that was a starting point, and that showed us that we could treat patients, and to our surprise all patients went into remission. I'm saying remission, not cure, but went into hematological remission, and we had no deaths in induction, despite the age of patient. The oldest patient was 89, so that's that, if you want to know, and that's how the whole story. That then continued with second generation TKI and third generation, so we've done the Zatin, but the point I would like to stress that in all our studies in Italy, called the corporate study group through the GMEMA, all our studies have never given systemic chemotherapy in induction. It's always been a TKI plus steroids, induction. One very important...
Only for elderly people?
No, for all patients.
For all patients.
Yeah, the first one, as I said, was EL. Then, based on the results of that, we obviously did it for all adult patients, 18 years up. And many studies was 18 up to whatever age, no age limit, because there's no chemotherapy. You give a pill orally. That's the other extraordinary point. So the bottom line is that we've used all inhibitors alone with steroids, and virtually all patients go into remission, between 94 and 100%. That is, and with virtually no death in induction. So this was the bottom line of the story. Now, one very important point is, and I'm saying this because EHA is a very big community. The world is very vast. We're not all the same. So to do all this, you have to identify the BCR-ABL at diagnosis immediately to start the TKI. You can't find it a month later. That means they have to get chemo. So you have a window of opportunity, because for ALL patients we tend to give a 1 week steroid. So in 1 week, if you do a study to find the Philadelphia chromosome or the BCR-ABL, then you start it. But you have a window of a week, 10 days, not more. So that's an important practical point. Over the world, how doable is this? So that is a starting point with induction.
With this induction, so you have the TKIs, you get everyone in induction. Are these in remission? Are these remissions durable? Do you need to add chemotherapy? Okay. You need to have maintenance?
Yeah, okay. So what has happened is that we did the induction with the TKI and steroids, and after that, either it was left in the studies to the centers, or we gave chemotherapy and transplant. So that was, the treatment was, it's not that we remove completely chemo at that point, and we come to the final story, which is a step forward. At that point, it was a TKI and steroid in induction, but then going to what you said, the question is what you do after the end of induction. Are they cured? And I said at the beginning, they're not cured. Some may be, but so after that, patients usually, it depends on obviously how old they are and how fit or comorbid they are, they generally get chemo and many get transplant. So that was, by giving steroids alone, you reduce the toxicity of steroids plus chemo. That was the point. Because many other groups around the world, and we did it too in the first study. In the first study, we added imatinib to the backbone of the chemo that we did at that time, but with intensive chemo. And we found we had to amend the protocol because it was because of toxicity. And this has been seen in other studies where TKI has been added to what was the conventional treatment, was intensive chemo. So the bottom line of that is that the combination is too toxic. So many groups use the de-intensify chemo plus TKI, which is better, which get less toxicity, but you still have some toxicity. We decided not to give chemo, but then you have to consolidate. So chemo was for consolidation and even transplant. So that was. Then things change again, maybe. I don't know if that's what you want.
I don't know. Up to you. There is something different from chemo that we can give after TKI?
So TKI is targeted treatment. So the next step, going back to what was a bit of my history, was could immunotherapy play a role? And the story goes that I mentioned the bispecific monoclonal antibodies and blinatumomab, which, as everybody knows, are bispecific that target CD19, which is expressed by leukemic B cells, and CD3 that activates the host immune T cells. So it's a form of immunotherapy. On one side, you target leukemia cell, the other T cells of the patient, activating them. So it's a form of immunotherapy. Now, we'd been working with Blina for many years. And Blina was initially produced by a small company in Germany called Micromet, and then was acquired by Amgen. And I tried with Micromet many years ago to get Blina, and I didn't manage because it was a small company, the production capability was limited. Then when Amgen took over, it changed, and that's how we could start the protocol with the blinatumomab. So the story goes, Blina has been used for relapsed patients, a B lineage because it's CD19, approved. And then it was the first monoclonal antibody approved to treat minimal residual disease. So that for the Philadelphia negative, and yes, also for Philadelphia positive. So what will happen is that we managed to get Blina for our last finished study, completed and published study in Philadelphia positive, frontline, all adult patients, 18 up, again, no age limit. And this was based on induction with dasatinib and steroid, and consolidation what with blinatumomab. So it was targeted treatment followed by immunotherapy. And the patients received, all patients, irrespective of degree of response to dasatinib, even if they're molecularly negative, all patients received a minimum of 2 cycles of Blina, and they could go up to 5 cycles. The primary endpoint of the study was the rate of molecular responses after 2 cycles of Blina. So induction and consolidation. The study was published in October 2020 in the New England Journal of Medicine, and it showed that virtually all patients, 98% went into remission, and that we had met the primary endpoint and we obtained 60% of molecular remission after 2 cycles of Blina. Dasatinib, no chemo. Now, interestingly, subsequently we found that the rate of molecular response increased further, 70–80% with more cycles of Blina. That's something that hadn't been reported further. So that was then New England asked us for an editorial, so we did a review article that was published last year in New England on management of Ph positive ALL. And I'm happy to say that we just submitted 10 days ago the update at more than 4 years of the DIALBA study, and the data looking extremely promising. I can say, it's not accepted yet, so, but I can say that at 4+ years, the overall and disease-free survival curves are extremely good, in the range of 75–80% at 4 years. And I can add that half of the patients, particularly those who became MRD negative, so that's underlying the role of MRD monitoring. This is all done centrally in our studies, all done centrally, all by quantitative PCR. Now, patients become MRD negative are doing extremely well. A patient becoming early MRD responsive, or so far we've seen no event. Now, of these patients, half of them have never gone to chemo, never gone to transplant. They've only received induction rotation and further TKI. Now, in the study finished with the primary endpoint, so every center was allowed after consolidation to decide whatever they thought best for patients. But all the data were accumulated in an ancillary GMEMA study, so I have all the information which have been put in a new paper that we sent out. And patients, it's good to say that the large majority of patients who obtained a molecular response were not transplanted. Luckily, probably we discussed it with the centers. In fact, of the patients who were not transplanted, 93% were molecular responders. Patients who were not in MRD negativity, the large majority were transplant and are doing very well. So transplant impacts if you're not MRD negative. This is all in a new paper. I'm saying things at 80%, not 100, because we don't know the fate of the paper yet. I think the other point, I think 2 points to say. The role of MRD.
That's the next question, so you can go ahead.
Okay, so we hadn't arranged it before, so it just, but Enrica knows hematology, so it makes life easier. MRD is a key point, and I think this is something we should stress, because if we want to manage well ALL, it might be different in other diseases. CLL may be different, but this is an acute leukemia. If we want to try to cure as in English, which is cure, as an ALL patient, you have to obtain MRD negativity. That does not mean that if you're MRD negative, you may not relapse. It does mean that if you're MRD positive, disease is still there. How do you do the MRD? That's the other key point. So we all feel in Europe, at least, that the best and most sensitive way is by quantitative PCR. And there are strict instructions for this. There's a EuroMRD consortium that works, we're part of it, and you have quality controls, etc., etc. So we feel that is a standard, and it is standard. Now there's interest in digital droplet PCR, in NGS, but these are all experimental. We've worked a lot on digital. The standard for us is quantitative PCR so far, and that should be done. If we look, that's the key point, and that's important. I mean, we have a drug approved for MRD, which is blina, so MRD has to be tested well, so that's a very important point. The other point I would add in the biology is that you have to do an extended biological workup of the genetic profile at diagnosis, because patients with a complex genetic landscape, patients that we call Icarus Plus, they have Icarus Plus other genetic, these patients do less well. But they do less well if you identify them. So again, go back to the role of laboratory for optimal management. And EHA is vast, so it covers the world. So I mean, this a message has to come through. If you can do all this, then you can optimize treatment. And so that, I think, is really the message comes up. So that is where we are now, and I think it's an important point.
So would you say that at the moment, basically of everything you have said until now, TKI and plus immunotherapy with blinatumomab can be a standard of care for every patient with Ph-positive ALL, including the one with genetic alteration negative, like Icarus Plus.
Okay. Now, in theory, yes. I mean, in a theoretical and ideal world, my answer would be a flat yes. You have to identify them quickly.
Yeah.
At the key point, we said it, it's a must. Then you give a pill. Now then, which pill? Which TKI? Because in the world, the only one that's worldwide approved for the frontline treatment is imatinib. Okay, give imatinib if you have nothing else. I'm not saying one's better than the other. Probably they are. But it could be that blina nullifies its effect. This is wishful thing. We don't know. We haven't firm data yet. It could be that any TKI is good enough. But now, the reality is that imatinib is the only one approved worldwide. After then, you have to give a pill. Now, blina is not approved. That's the problem. So it's approved for MRD positive, not everywhere. EMA is not approved for MRD positive, Philadelphia positive. FDA has. So the countries that follow FDA, yes, the countries in Europe no, which is a big limit, unfortunately. So some countries can give it. Now, in an ideal world, that's why I started saying this, I would certainly say the standard is TKI plus blina. The problem is that very few can do that combination. Now, in this respect, we now have an ongoing study, which is a follow-up of this DiALBA that I mentioned, which is well down the road. And this is the first ever randomized study. And this randomization is done to get approval from the authorities. So the experimental arm will be with the third generation TKI ponatinib and blina. Experimental arm, the control arm will be imatinib plus chemo, and because we want it to be approved for everybody, the other combination. It'll be 2-to-1 for the experimental, and there'll be a crossover for safety reasons. And patients will only go to transplant. Oh, so this is in the protocol. Only go to if they have the additional genetic abnormality I'm mentioning, they remain MRD positive. Or they have some
the blina.
after the blina. If they are, so if they're MRD negative, don't have additional genetic abnormality, they will not be transplanted, even if they're 19-year-old and have a sibling donor. So this will be the first time that you will formally prove that you can avoid it. I told you that patients who avoided it well, but it wasn't in the protocol. This will be in the protocol, and so the study is already enrolled. It's a 236 patients, a very big study, but we already enrolled 106 patients, so we hope to finish it next year. So that will probably redefine the management of Philadelphia. If I may, just 1 second, say that I travel a lot with these data. I mean, and I still see in many parts of the world giving a TKI plus intensive chemo. I mean, this is, to me, it's really unacceptable because you're losing patients. Yeah. Many patients, even in remission, are transplanted, and there's a transplant-related mortality. So this is hard to accept. At least give a TKI either without chemo or with very mild chemo. But there's no reason to give intensive chemo and TKI, and I still see this in many parts of the world. So if I may just make a plea on this, I think this should be completely avoided. This is, we can really try to, as long as we diagnose them immediately, so the message is diagnose immediately within 1 week, and this should be done because for CML this was done in the old days, not maybe by molecular, but at least by the cytogenetics. Then give a TKI. If you want to give chemo, either in induction, you give mild chemo, or else consolidate later. First put patient in remission and then consolidate. If you can give blina, but most centers could not give it, that's even better because you can avoid chemotherapy. But then you have the laboratories for MRD. They have to be available and they have to be standardized and certified laboratories.
Thank you very much. It was very clear and very passionate. Thanks.
It's a nice story for an end of a long hematological life, because I think, I mean, as I said earlier, the younger generation, in the war, they say, the patient lucky has a Philadelphia positive ALL. As I said, for us in the old days, this was a death sentence. So this has to be underlined. There's a patient who came, she was 70. I remember very well because I saw her that day. And I spoke to her, and she was diagnosed with Philadelphia positive ALL. She was terrified, not terrified, she was worried for her husband. I remember very well this lady. Worried for her husband because very often males are less strong than women, so she was worried for him. So I told her, listen, things are changing. Now you will give you a pill, and we treat her with imatinib. That was 20 years ago, 20 or 21 years ago. She turned 90, I don't know if this year or last year, alive. So she lived 20 years, having diagnosed with Philadelphia the day of her 70th birthday.
If I can say, this is what I like about hematology. You have this